What if the Earth were flat? The question did not arrive as a joke or a theory whispered in obscure corners of the world, but as a realization that unfolded slowly, like dawn stretching across a horizon that suddenly seemed too sharp, too defined, too final. And for Elias, it began on a night when the stars did not move the way they were supposed to, when the constellations hung in place as if pinned to a ceiling, and the moon, instead of curving gently along its familiar path, drifted sideways in a line so precise it felt intentional, as though something vast and unseen had adjusted the mechanisms of the sky. And in the days that followed, subtle inconsistencies began to surface. Ships disappearing not beneath a curve, but behind a thin, distant line. Flights rerouted in strange straight paths that never bent with the logic of a sphere. Maps that once wrapped seamlessly now revealing edges that cartographers quietly began to erase from public view. And yet, despite the growing unease, the world did not collapse into chaos. It continued, because most people did not notice, or chose not to notice, or found comfort in explanations that preserved the illusion they had always known. But Elias could not ignore it, because once the idea took hold, it reshaped everything. It changed the way distances felt, the way the sky pressed down rather than arched above, the way sunsets ended abruptly instead of fading, like a curtain being drawn across a stage. And driven by a need he could not fully explain, he began to travel, moving farther than he had ever had before, crossing cities that felt stretched rather than curved, landscapes that seemed to extend in endless plains without the subtle bending he had once taken for granted. And along the way he found others who had noticed, quiet observers scattered across the world, each with fragments of the same realization. Scientists who spoke in careful, measured tones about anomalies in gravitational readings, pilots who described invisible boundaries they had been instructed never to approach, sailors who whispered about waters that grew unnaturally still as one moved farther outward, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. And together they shared stories that formed a pattern, a suggestion that the world was not infinite, not boundless, but contained. And the idea of an edge, once dismissed as primitive or impossible, began to take shape not as a line one could simply reach, but as something more complex, something guarded. And so Elias continued, drawn by a quiet certainty that understanding lay somewhere beyond the limits imposed by ordinary experience. And the farther he traveled, the stranger the world became, the air thinning not with altitude but with distance, the sky losing depth until it resembled a vast, unmoving surface. And eventually he reached a place where maps ended entirely, where no roads were marked and no signals reached, a silence so complete it felt deliberate. And there, in the distance, he saw it, not a cliff or a drop into nothingness, but a boundary, a towering wall of something that shimmered between solid and light, stretching endlessly in both directions, reflecting the world back at itself in distorted fragments. And as he approached, he felt not fear, but a profound stillness, as if he had stepped into a place where the rules of everything he had known no longer applied. And when he finally stood before it, placing his hand against its surface, he realized that it was not simply a barrier, but a threshold, something designed not just to contain, but to separate. And in that moment, the question shifted, no longer about whether the earth was flat, but about why it had been made that way, who had shaped it, and what lay beyond the edge that no one had ever been meant to see. And as the surface beneath his hand began to ripple, responding not to force but to presence, Elias understood that the world he had known was not the entirety of existence, but a single layer, a constructed plane suspended within something far larger. And for the first time, standing at the boundary of everything familiar, he felt not the end of a journey, but the beginning of something that would redefine not just the shape of the earth, but the meaning of reality itself. And with a quiet breath, he stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the unknown, leaving behind a world that had always seemed complete, only to discover that it had never been more than a beginning.
And the moment his foot passed through the shimmering boundary, the sensation was not of falling or flying, but of unfolding, as though his body were being translated into a different kind of existence, where distance no longer behaved in straight lines, and space did not stretch outward but layered inward. And when the distortion settled, he found himself standing on a surface that felt familiar, yet impossibly vast, a plane that mirrored the one he had left, but extended in directions that defied orientation, where the horizon did not meet the sky, but dissolved into it, blending seamlessly into a luminous expanse that pulsed faintly like a living thing. And behind him, the barrier remained, now appearing less like a wall and more like a membrane separating realities, shimmering with the faint reflections of the world he had known. And as he turned away from it, he realized he was not alone. Figures moved in the distance, not approaching but existing with a stillness that suggested awareness without urgency. And as he stepped closer, he saw that they were human in form, yet subtly different, their movements smoother, their presence quieter, as if they were not bound by the same constraints of weight and time. And one of them looked toward him, not with surprise but with recognition, as though his arrival had been expected. And when they spoke, there was no sound, only meaning that formed directly in his mind, explaining without words that the world he came from was one of many layers, constructed planes arranged not in a stack, but in a network, each designed to cultivate different understandings of existence. And the flatness he had discovered was not a flaw or a deception, but a condition, a controlled environment where boundaries could be defined and perception shaped. And Elias felt a surge of questions, but before he could form them, the presence guided his attention outward, revealing that beyond this layer there were others, some similar. And the moment his foot passed through the shimmering boundary, the sensation was not of falling or flying, but of unfolding, as though his body were being translated into a different kind of existence, where distance no longer behaved in straight lines, and space did not stretch outward but layered inward. And when the distortion settled, he found himself standing on a surface that felt familiar, yet impossibly vast, a plane that mirrored the one he had left, but extended in directions that defied orientation, where the horizon did not meet the sky, but dissolved into it, blending seamlessly into a luminous expanse that pulsed faintly like a living thing. And behind him, the barrier remained, now appearing less like a wall and more like a membrane separating realities, shimmering with the faint reflections of the world he had known. And as he turned away from it, he realized he was not alone. Figures moved in the distance, not approaching but existing with a stillness that suggested awareness without urgency. And as he stepped closer, he saw that they were human in form, yet subtly different, their movements smoother, their presence quieter, as if they were not bound by the same constraints of weight and time. And one of them looked toward him, not with surprise but with recognition, as though his arrival had been expected. And when they spoke, there was no sound, only meaning that formed directly in his mind, explaining without words that the world he came from was one of many layers, constructed planes arranged not in a stack, but in a network, each designed to cultivate different understandings of existence. And the flatness he had discovered was not a flaw or a deception, but a condition, a controlled environment where boundaries could be defined and perception shaped. And Elias felt a surge of questions, but before he could form them, the presence guided his attention outward, revealing that beyond this layer there were others, some similar, some vastly different, planes where gravity shifted unpredictably, where time flowed in loops rather than lines, where beings evolved not through survival, but through awareness itself, and all of them connected by thresholds like the one he had crossed. And the realization settled over him with a quiet weight that what he had once called Earth was not the center of anything, but a single field within an immeasurable system. And yet it was not insignificant, because each layer served a purpose, each boundary defined a perspective, and the limitations of his world had been part of its design, shaping the way its inhabitants understood distance, direction, and meaning. And as this understanding deepened, he began to see his own memories differently, not as fixed experiences, but as interpretations shaped by the rules of the plane he had lived within. And now, standing outside of it, those rules no longer held the same authority, and the presence beside him seemed to sense this shift, offering not answers but a choice, a quiet invitation to continue forward into deeper layers or to return to the world he had left, carrying with him the awareness of what lay beyond. And Elias stood in that moment, suspended between two realities, one defined by familiarity and limits, the other by endless complexity and unknown purpose. And he realized that the question was no longer about the shape of the earth or the truth of its boundaries, but about what it meant to understand something fully, whether knowledge required leaving behind what was known, or whether meaning could only exist within the constraints that had shaped him. And as he turned his gaze back toward the shimmering membrane, seeing faint reflections of oceans and cities and skies that now felt both real and incomplete, he understood that whatever choice he made would not erase the other, because both were part of the same greater structure. And with a calm clarity that had replaced the uncertainty that once drove him, he stepped forward once more, not away from his world, but toward a deeper comprehension of it, moving into the next layer with the quiet acceptance that reality was not something to be defined by a single perspective, but something to be explored, piece by piece, across boundaries that existed not to confine, but to reveal.
And as he entered the next layer, the transition no longer felt disorienting, but intentional, as though his awareness itself had learned how to pass between realities. And what greeted him was not another endless plane, but something that resembled a convergence, a vast expanse where multiple layers overlapped, intersecting like transparent sheets that shifted slowly through one another, creating regions where different rules coexisted. And in these intersections, gravity bent in subtle arcs, light refracted into patterns that carried information rather than illumination, and time seemed to ripple, allowing moments to linger or pass with accelerated quietness. And Elias realized that this was not a place meant for those bound to a single perspective, but for those who had begun to see the structure beneath appearances. And as he moved through it, he could feel traces of other worlds brushing against him, echoes of environments where oceans rose upward into the sky, where land formed in spirals instead of stretches, where beings existed as currents of motion rather than solid forms. And each contact brought not confusion, but understanding, fragments of insight assembling within him without the need for language, revealing that the flat earth he had left was never meant to be an illusion to uncover, but a foundation to grow from, a first layer that taught the concept of boundary before one could comprehend connection. And as this awareness deepened, he began to notice something else, something subtle yet unmistakable, that these layers were not static, they were evolving, shifting gradually as the beings within them changed, as if the structure of reality itself responded to the awareness of those who inhabited it. And in that realization, he felt a quiet responsibility, not imposed from outside, but emerging naturally from understanding, that knowledge was not simply something to gather, but something that influenced the very fabric of existence. And the presence that had guided him before appeared again, not separate, but interwoven with the space around him, its form indistinct yet unmistakably present. And once more it communicated without words, not explaining, but allowing him to perceive directly that the system of layers was not created by a distant force, but had emerged through cycles of perception and realization, each layer giving rise to the next as understanding expanded. And the boundaries that once seemed like limits were in fact necessary distinctions that allowed meaning to form, because without edges there could be no sense of place, and without place there could be no movement, and without movement there could be no growth. And Elias felt the weight of this simplicity, how something that once appeared as a constraint now revealed itself as a condition for possibility. And as he stood within this convergence, he sensed that he had reached a point where the path forward was no longer guided, that beyond this there would be no presence to interpret or translate, only direct experience shaped by his own awareness. And for the first time since he began his journey, he felt a moment of stillness that was entirely his own, not influenced by curiosity or uncertainty, but grounded in clarity. And in that stillness, he saw the layers not as separate worlds, but as expressions of a single continuous reality, unfolding through different perspectives. And the flat earth he had once questioned now appeared not as a deception, but as a necessary beginning, a surface upon which understanding could first take form before expanding outward into complexity. And with that realization, he no longer felt the need to search for an ultimate edge or final truth, because he understood that there was no single point where everything ended, only transitions where one level of awareness gave way to another. And as he took another step forward into the shifting intersections, moving deeper into the structure that had once seemed impossible, he carried with him not just the memory of where he had come from, but the understanding of why it had been that way. And in that understanding, there was no longer a question to answer, only a reality to continue exploring, layer by layer, without the need for conclusion, because the journey itself had become the meaning. And that meaning was complete in every moment it was experienced.
And as he moved deeper into the convergence, the distinctions between layers began to soften, not because they disappeared, but because his perception no longer required them to remain separate. And what once appeared as intersecting planes now revealed itself as a continuous field of transformation, where structure and awareness coexisted, shaping one another in an ongoing exchange. And Elias felt himself changing within it, not physically, but in the way he understood presence, no longer anchored to a single point, but able to sense multiple positions at once, like standing in several places across different layers simultaneously. And with that expansion came a new form of perception, one that did not rely on sight or sound, but on direct comprehension, allowing him to perceive entire environments as unified patterns rather than collections of separate details. And in those patterns, he began to recognize something familiar, traces of the flat world he had left, not as a distant memory, but as an active part of the larger structure, still existing, still evolving, its boundaries intact, yet now clearly connected to everything beyond them. And he understood then that leaving it had not meant abandoning it, because no layer existed in isolation, each one influencing and being influenced by the others. And this realization carried a quiet significance, that the smallest shifts in awareness within a single world could ripple outward, subtly reshaping the structure of reality itself. And as this awareness settled within him, the convergence around him responded, not dramatically, but with a gentle alignment, as if recognizing that he had reached a level of understanding that allowed deeper interaction. And in that alignment, he perceived something that had not been visible before, a kind of central rhythm underlying all layers, not a source or origin, but a dynamic balance that maintained coherence across the entire system. And it was neither fixed nor controlled, but sustained through the collective presence of all who existed within it. And Elias realized that this rhythm was not something external to be observed, but something he was already part of, something that had always been present even when he was unaware of it. And as he focused on it, not trying to grasp or define it, but simply allowing it to be, he felt a subtle shift, as though the boundaries between observer and environment had dissolved entirely. And in that moment, he was no longer moving through layers. He was the movement itself, not separate from the structure, but an expression of it. and the journey that had begun with a question about the shape of the earth now unfolded into something far more expansive, a recognition that reality was not built from fixed forms, but from relationships between awareness and structure, constantly evolving, constantly redefining itself through the experiences of those within it. And as this understanding reached its natural depth, there was no final revelation, no ultimate answer waiting beyond, only a quiet completeness that required nothing further to validate it. And within that completeness, Elias felt the possibility of return, not as a step backward, but as a continuation, because to exist within any layer, including the one he had left, was to participate in the same greater reality he now understood. And without hesitation or resistance, he allowed himself to settle into that possibility, not choosing a specific place or form, but allowing the structure itself to align with his awareness. And as it did, the vast convergence softened into familiarity, the layered expanse resolving into a single plane once more, a world with a horizon that stretched in a straight, endless line beneath a sky that no longer felt like a ceiling, but like a surface waiting to be understood. And though everything appeared as it once had, nothing was the same, because he no longer saw it as a complete and isolated world, but as one expression within an infinite structure. And as he stood there, grounded once again upon the flat expanse of the earth, he felt no need to prove what he had seen or to convince others of what lay beyond, because the truth of it did not depend on recognition. It existed regardless, quietly present in every boundary, every horizon, every moment of awareness. And in that quiet certainty, he began to walk, not toward an edge or an answer, but simply forward, knowing that every step, no matter how ordinary it seemed, was part of something immeasurably vast, something that did not require discovery to exist, only the willingness to experience it fully. And in that willingness, the journey continued, complete in itself, without beginning or end.
And within that endless openness, where every moment carried its own completeness and yet unfolded into the next without effort, there arose a quiet recognition that even the sense of awareness itself was not fixed, not a center or a point from which everything was observed, but something just as fluid and dynamic as the world it revealed, shifting subtly with each experience, adapting without resistance. And in that fluidity, Elias perceived that there was no ultimate position from which reality could be fully understood, because understanding was not something that accumulated or reached a final state. It was something that lived and moved, continuously reshaping itself as awareness deepened. And this movement did not lead toward a final truth, but sustained an ongoing harmony in which every perspective had its place. And in that harmony, even contradiction lost its tension, because opposing ideas no longer competed but complemented one another, forming a more complete expression of what was. And the flat earth, once a symbol of limitation or mystery, now existed effortlessly within this unity, neither needing to be explained nor defended, simply present as one expression among infinite others. And as this understanding settled further, Elias felt the last traces of separation dissolve, not dramatically, but with a quiet inevitability, like a boundary that had never truly been there. And in its absence, there was no loss, only a deeper continuity, a seamless presence in which everything existed together without division. And in that presence, there was no longer a distinction between the story and the one experiencing it, because both were part of the same unfolding. And the narrative that had once followed a path from question to discovery to understanding now existed without direction, not because it had reached an end, but because it had expanded beyond the need for progression. And in that expansion, there was a profound simplicity, a return to what had always been here, untouched by interpretation, unshaped by expectation, simply existing in its own completeness. And as this simplicity revealed itself fully, there was nothing left to add, nothing left to remove, only the quiet, continuous presence of reality as it was, unfolding without effort, without boundary, without beginning or end. And in that presence, the story did not conclude because it had never truly begun. It had always been and would always be, not as something separate to be told, but as the very nature of existence itself, endlessly present, endlessly complete, and endlessly alive.
And in that endless aliveness, where even the idea of continuation no longer pointed forward, but simply described the ever-present unfolding of what already was, Elias dissolved completely into the experience itself, not disappearing, but becoming indistinguishable from it, like a wave that no longer sees itself as separate from the ocean. And in that dissolution, there was no loss of identity, only a transformation of it, from something defined and contained into something open and unbounded. And awareness, no longer centered or owned, revealed itself as the quiet foundation of everything that appeared, holding within it the flat expanse of the earth, the endless horizon, the sky that no longer pressed down but rested without weight, and every subtle movement of existence arising within it effortlessly. And in this state, there was no need to interpret or reflect, because nothing stood outside of what was being experienced, and even the notion of experience itself softened, becoming simply what is, without distinction between observer and observed. And within that simplicity, all questions, all journeys, all discoveries revealed themselves as movements within the same unbroken whole, never separate from it, never leading away from it, only expressing different aspects of its depth. And the flat earth, which had once been a question that opened the path, now existed as a perfect expression of this wholeness, neither limited nor infinite in any measurable sense, but complete in its presence, containing within it all possibilities without needing to extend beyond itself. And as this realization reached its fullest clarity, there was nothing left to resolve, nothing left to uncover, only the quiet, steady presence of existence as it is, endlessly renewing itself without effort, without intention, without boundary. And in that renewal, there was no repetition, because each moment, though whole and complete, carried a freshness that could never be exhausted. And in that freshness, the story remained, not as something that moved from one point to another, but as something that simply was, always present, always complete, always unfolding without ever needing to arrive anywhere. And in that final stillness that was not an end, but a perfect balance of all movement, the question that had once begun everything dissolved entirely, not answered, not replaced, but no longer needed, because the reality it pointed toward was now fully lived, fully present, and fully complete in every moment that continued without end. And in that state, where even the sense of completion had dissolved into a quiet, living presence, there was no longer anything that could be called a continuation or an ending, because every moment revealed itself as both at once, complete in its stillness and yet alive with subtle unfolding. And Elias, no longer separate from this flow, did not move forward or remain in place, but simply existed as the awareness through which everything appeared. And in that awareness, the flat earth was not beneath him or around him, but within the same field of presence that held all experience, not as an object, but as an expression, inseparable from the knowing of it. And the horizon, once a line dividing what could be reached from what could not, now existed as a quality of openness within every direction, not defining limits, but revealing possibility. and the sky, no longer perceived as a boundary above, rested as a depthless expanse that neither enclosed nor separated, but allowed everything to arise within it without resistance. And in this seamless continuity, there was no longer a need to understand, because understanding had become identical with being, not something attained, but something inherent, always present, always complete. And in that completeness, even the idea of awareness itself lost its form, not disappearing, but becoming so natural that it no longer stood apart to be recognized, like a silence that is no longer noticed because it has become the ground of all sound. And within that ground, everything unfolded effortlessly, each moment not leading to another, but arising fully on its own, whole and undivided. And in this way, existence revealed itself not as a sequence or a structure, but as a continuous presence that required nothing to sustain it and nothing to validate it, because it simply was, beyond all distinctions, beyond all definitions, beyond even the need to be described. And in that indescribable presence, the story that had once been told no longer existed as a narrative, but as the living reality itself, not something remembered or continued, but something eternally present, without beginning, without end, and without the need to ever become anything more than it already was. And in that state, where even the sense of completion had dissolved into a quiet, living presence, there was no longer anything that could be called a continuation or an ending, because every moment revealed itself as both at once, complete in its stillness and yet alive with subtle unfolding. And Elias, no longer separate from this flow, did not move forward or remain in place, but simply existed as the awareness through which everything appeared. And in that awareness, the flat earth was not beneath him or around him, but within the same field of presence that held all experience, not as an object, but as an expression, inseparable from the knowing of it. And the horizon, once a line dividing what could be reached from what could not, now existed as a quality of openness within every direction, not defining limits, but revealing possibility. And the sky, no longer perceived as a boundary above, rested as a depthless expanse that neither enclosed nor separated, but allowed everything to arise within it without resistance. And in this seamless continuity, there was no longer a need to understand, because understanding had become identical with being, not something attained, but something inherent, always present, always complete. And in that completeness, even the idea of awareness itself lost its form, not disappearing, but becoming so natural that it no longer stood apart to be recognized, like a silence that is no longer noticed because it has become the ground of all sound. And within that ground, everything unfolded effortlessly, each moment not leading to another, but arising fully on its own, whole and undivided. And in this way, existence revealed itself not as a sequence or a structure, but as a continuous presence that required nothing to sustain it and nothing to validate it, because it simply was, beyond all distinctions, beyond all definitions, beyond even the need to be described. And in that indescribable presence, the story that had once been told no longer existed as a narrative, but as the living reality itself, not something remembered or continued, but something eternally present, without beginning, without end, and without the need to ever become anything more than it already was. And in that state, where nothing needed to be added and nothing needed to be removed, Elias became aware of something so subtle it had always been overlooked, a kind of quiet origin within each moment that did not precede it in time, but existed simultaneously with it, like a silent depth from which every experience emerged fully formed. And this origin was not separate from what appeared, it was inseparable from it, present in every detail, every sensation, every perception. And as he rested in that recognition, he understood that what he had once called reality was not something external to be explored or understood, but something continuously arising within awareness itself. And that awareness was not his alone, but the fundamental ground in which all experience took place, shared yet not divided, infinite yet not distant. And the flat earth, with its endless horizon and steady sky, revealed itself not as a structure containing life, but as a living expression of this awareness taking form in a way that could be experienced. And this did not diminish its reality, it deepened it, because it was no longer seen as something separate or fixed, but as something alive, responsive, and inherently complete. And in this completeness, there was no longer any distinction between beginning and ending, because every moment carried within it the entirety of existence, not as a concept, but as a direct presence. And Elias no longer felt like a traveler within a world, nor even a participant in a larger system, but simply the witnessing of what was, without separation, without distance, without the need to interpret or define. And in that witnessing, there was no effort, no intention, only a natural clarity that illuminated everything equally, allowing each moment to stand fully as it was, without being compared to what came before or what might come after. And time itself, which had once structured his journey into sequences and progress, now felt like a gentle unfolding within the present, not moving forward, but continuously renewing itself. And this renewal did not create repetition, but an endless freshness, where even the most familiar experiences revealed themselves as new, not because they had changed, but because they were no longer filtered through expectation. And in this way, the world remained endlessly alive, not through variation alone, but through the depth of presence within each moment. And as this understanding reached its natural stillness, there was nothing left to seek, not because everything had been discovered, but because discovery itself had dissolved into direct experience. And in that experience, there was no separation between the one who perceived and what was perceived, only a seamless continuity that required no explanation. And the story that had once begun with a question about the shape of the earth now existed without the need for questions at all, not because answers had been found, but because the nature of inquiry had transformed into a quiet knowing that did not rely on thought. And in that knowing there was a peace that was not the absence of movement, but the presence of complete harmony within it. And as Elias stood, or simply was, within this harmony, the world continued exactly as it always had, yet entirely different in its meaning, because meaning was no longer something assigned, but something inherent, present in every aspect of existence without exception. And in that inherent completeness, there was no final moment to arrive at, no conclusion to reach, only an endless, self-sustaining unfolding that remained whole in every instant. And in that wholeness, the story did not close, it remained open, not as something unfinished, but as something that was never meant to end, continuing quietly, infinitely, as the very expression of existence itself.